I'm Jacqueline Maley and you're listening to Inside Politics from the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. It has been quite a week in federal politics. We had Barnaby Joyce administering some tough love to his dog live on national television. We had Pauline Hanson make some incredibly controversial remarks about domestic violence. And meanwhile, down in Adelaide, the Prime Minister is at the Labor National Conference, attempting to placate the grassroots of his party while also trying to keep himself electable. So much to discuss. Joining me this week from the Labor Conference in Adelaide, we have our Chief Political Correspondent, Paul Sakkal, as usual, and Federal Political Correspondent, Natassia Chrysanthos. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hello from the City of Churches.
Yeah, how's the weather down in Adelaide?
It's a bit gloomy.
But the lights are bright inside the Adelaide Convention Centre, which is the only weather we're really experiencing.
Right. It's not the most atmospheric of venues, but, you know, it gets the job done. First up, I want to talk about One Nation because they've really continued to dominate headlines this week, and that itself is important because gaining attention and outrage is very much a part of the political strategy of the party, or so it seems. Paul, most people by now will be familiar with Barnaby Joyce shouting at his dog during an interview with Sarah Ferguson on the ABC's 7:30 program, I think on Tuesday night. What did you make of that little piece of political theatre, which has gone global, for better or for worse?
It's pretty extraordinary. It's in lots of the major newspapers, lots of the big TV channels. I can't remember a news story in Australia that's kicked off to that extent, probably some crazy crime. I'm sure everyone has seen this by now. This is Barnaby Joyce on the 7:30 report yelling at his dog Stella.
Are you really comfortable with where she is taking you?
I think, sit down! Sorry, it's a dog.
It's the latest moment in what's felt like kind of a month of a media cycle that has a similar theme, which is One Nation being placed more firmly under the spotlight, contentious claims being made on race relations. If you're talking about the Senator, Malcolm Roberts, various conspiracy theories, and on the Barnaby Joyce side, him kind of cleaning up this mess and adding his own eccentricity into the mix as well. And if you're One Nation, you're probably worried about the perception that they're a bit of a ragged mess. But on the other hand, attention is everything in politics, and their polling position is strong despite a recent blip. And there's an argument that these kinds of moments cement their status as the disruptor, the kind of transgressive force in politics who are doing things a little bit differently. People aren't paying that much attention to politics mid-cycle. It's really hard for the major parties to grab attention, which is what this conference is about. And so at least they're in the algorithm. That's how they'd be thinking about it. But there's obviously downside if you look a bit too sloppy.
They're dominating the algorithm. And as you say, they've gone global. I mean, I've seen it all over my Instagram feed. Even Pod Save America, which is an American podcast by some Democrat guys, they got into it. They brought up
sophisticated political guys.
Yeah. When you look at the broader interview, though, what Sarah Ferguson was pressing Barnaby Joyce on, and he gets increasingly tetchy as the interview goes on, to the extent where he tells Sarah Ferguson not to be rude because she's pressing him on a question. The question she's pressing him on is whether or not Pauline Hanson, who's making extremely sort of increasingly extreme remarks about immigrants, particularly Muslim immigrants. There was a whole Tommy Robinson sort of podcast interview that she did. Sarah Ferguson is asking Barnaby Joyce, is Pauline Hanson taking you further to the right and further to the extremes than you are comfortable with? And he actually didn't answer that question. Is there a schism forming there?
Yeah, that was the question that when the dog set him off. But as you say, he was kind of getting increasingly frustrated as the interview went on. We reported the week before that interview that he was privately grumbling about Pauline Hanson's trip to Europe. He thought that Tommy Robinson, even though he agrees with the thesis on political Islam, he thought that Tommy Robinson was a character who shouldn't be dealt with. He's a thug, he's a criminal, he's a racist. So Joyce was privately grumbling to his associates and his family back home. And he started playing this role over the past couple of weeks that our colleague Rob Harris has described as the explainer-in-chief. He's been back in Australia doing every media outlet possible, not knocking back any media request, explaining all of these sometimes outrageous claims from Pauline Hanson overseas. And there has been a narrative building in Canberra that Barnaby Joyce is becoming worried about the One Nation show and sensing that it's not on track. And that interview could have indicated that it all got a bit much for him. he was being asked really tricky questions by a fantastic interviewer, Sarah Ferguson. And he started off the interview tetchy to begin with. He said, "Oh, are you really welcoming me on the show? Don't know if you're happy for me to be here," or something along those lines. And as the questions got tougher, he became increasingly tetchy. Sarah Ferguson, I think she suggested in that line when he punched back and called her rude, it seemed to be implicit in her comment that she thought the dog might be a fake and that there was not really any dog there. Like, focus on the question.
Look, I could hear the dog because some people have suggested that the dog was fake and it was just a sort of ruse to not answer the question. I could actually hear the dog when I was listening to it, when I was listening back to it. Sarah Ferguson has said that she could hear a dog too. So we are taking on faith the existence of Stella, the Border Collie cross. I think she is, maybe a terrier as well.
There's a big narrative online that the dog was fake.
I know.
It's going around Twitter.
Well, you can't. Yeah, it's very hard to get to the bottom of this masher. We need proof of life of the dog. Anyway, I mean, broadly, Sarah Ferguson was pointing out that, Pauline Hanson had said on the Spotlight program when she was walking around, I think Lucian in the UK with Tommy Robinson, a comment, "Muslims breed and the taxpayer pays." She was asking whether he was comfortable with that, with Hanson taking him into a place of racial discrimination, which that pretty clearly sounds like. Is he sort of going to continue to be happily cleaning up these kinds of messes, do you think?
Well, that question that you just mentioned from Ferguson was such a pertinent one because there was a conversation at the time Joyce joined One Nation around his positioning on migration and race in his career. I think Phil Curry wrote a column saying that Joyce has never been a race baiter. He has been quite liberal on these issues for a Conservative. People will recall he was a big supporter of the Billawheeler refugee family, very impassioned supporter. He's a Jesuit Catholic. Jesuit Catholics tend to have pretty strong social justice values on these issues. And so there's always been this question about whether Joyce would go along with the race and migration element of the One Nation agenda. He's a populist in all different kinds of forms, but not traditionally on that issue. And so, as we reported and as seemed to come to a head in that interview, there is this sense that Joyce is not quite in line with Hanson on racial issues, although he has been saying both privately and publicly that the more he thinks about the warning signs from Britain about having too big a proportion of your country that are of Muslim background, he's becoming increasingly worried that that is the path Australia is on. So he would reject this thesis, but that's been a question that people have asked.
Yeah. The other thing that Pauline Hanson is reported as saying this week was these very controversial comments about domestic violence. She was asked about domestic violence, I think, on a Brisbane radio show. She was specifically asked us what her message was to men who abuse their female partners. And she said that while she had she said that she'd suffered domestic violence herself and that she had left. She advised women to leave. But she also said that it's a two-way street. What did you make of those comments and how do you think they'll land with mainstream voters?
Yeah, I think, look, she's kind of attempted to walk them back or clarify what she meant. But, our colleagues Brittany Bush and Rob Harris have got another story today that go back to interview comments she gave on a podcast last year, which kind of, insinuate that the child support system is a scam and so forth. So she's obviously got form here, defending fathers in the family court, all of that kind of stuff. I think the more important question, which is the one that you raise, is how does this land? And I think it's reflective of a bit of a trend we're seeing with Hanson, similar to her comments on paid parental leave, similar to her comments about, workers being lazy and seeking to sack them. These are kind of quite strong cultural topics, but in areas that are slightly more niche, perhaps, and that don't necessarily, I think, land with most Australians, or it's not what most Australians are thinking about. Most Australians, I don't think, are talking about domestic violence in the context of, is domestic violence leave a scam? Are police resources being unreasonably diverted to DV cases? And so I don't know that this is the most favourable area for her to be playing in politically.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a topic that men's rights activists and certain elements of, very sort of far-right populism around the world would it's very much from that playbook. It fortunately hasn't been a feature of Australian politics in quite some time, but we might see that come back. Paul, you had a story this week about Alex Antic, who's a South Australian Liberal senator who's something of a rebel. He's often been very complimentary of One Nation in the past, and you reported him as saying that One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts is, quote, a clear thinker. Now, Malcolm Roberts has promoted conspiracy theories. You've written a lot about that. He's praised Vladimir Putin, among other things. You reported, in the context of Alex Antic, that he's becoming a bit of a problem for the Liberals, particularly because he might be angling for a One Nation Liberal Party coalition in the state of South Australia, where he's from. What did Angus Taylor have to say about that proposition?
Well, he was firmer than I thought he would be, Angus Taylor, when asked about our story a couple of days ago. He was in Brisbane up for an economic forum and was asked about this prospect of the hard-right South Australian Senator Alex Antic shifting the South Australian division of the party, in which he's got significant control, to be closer to One Nation, potentially forming some sort of state-based alliance or coalition with the rump of MPs they still have in that state. And Angus Taylor was very firm. He said, Alex's view is irrelevant here. That will not be happening. It will not be tolerated, and there'll be no conversation of any similar sort. And the reason for that is because Alex Antic has been an irritant to a number of coalition leaders, but he's been accepted because he's been seen as on the fringe, doing his thing in the online right ecosystem. He does have a significant audience online. I wouldn't underplay the extent to which, that backlash to what, people on the right view as the overreach of the Me Too movement and other things have led to the rise of people like Alex Antic in certain parts of the internet that Pauline Hanson's trying to tap into. So people see him as someone who's built up a fairly large following and so deserves respect. But for the first time, he's encroached into terrain which has caused higher-ups to think, okay, this is now potentially a serious problem, because if he seizes control of the South Australian division and he's running for president of that division, which is very unorthodox for a sitting senator, in fact, it's never happened before, if he does take control and executes this idea of embracing One Nation, that has national implications, because Labor would point to that and say, look, the Liberals actually do want to do a deal with One Nation that's not just on preferences, but they want to merge the parties. And so Angus Taylor has set a clear red line there by putting his foot down.
Yeah. Tass, how do you think Angus Taylor is going generally in countering One Nation, and has he sharpened up his attack recently?
I think he's sharpened up for sure. I think what Paul just said is one example of that. I think he gave this speech a couple of weeks ago as well, which was really emphasising, the harm of One Nation's policies. I think it took a while to get there. He's kind of been treading lightly in a lot of stuff to do with One Nation over the last few months. So I think where he's landed seems better, because at least also he's just then able to quash some of this speculation about the Liberals' level of cooperation with One Nation, for example, with things like preference deals. It's easy to make those conversations go away and focus on what you want to focus on when you have a clear answer. So I think he's doing that a lot better. I think the dilemma for poor Angus Taylor, it's not for lack of trying. I think that he's not cutting through. Like, he's come out with some quite bold policies or rhetoric. His immigration stuff early this year was very inflammatory. His budget reply, and his position on income tax, indexing tax brackets to end bracket creep. That's a big idea that, that beckons a lot of questions about budget management and all of that stuff that he's not really being asked, because he's just not cutting through. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier around the attention economy. When you've got Pauline Hanson on a pool deck with Gina Reinhardt in Sicily and attending a fashion show, and Barnaby Joyce doing like a pistol and boo dog stunt many years later. Yeah. Like it's hard. These are they're like, in some cases they're but say, for example, in the DV thing, this is a kind of news cycle that's emerged in the last 24 hours that goes around genuine scrutiny, stuff like the dog stuff or the fashion show. They're more gaff related, but either way, they just, I think, take people's attentions, whether it's in the mainstream news or on social media. And One Nation just becomes the kind of default subject of interest, I think, for people who are paying attention to politics.
I wonder, in a world where you have One Nation making, various people from One Nation, notably Pauline Hanson, making these really brash, bold, strong occasionally extreme statements where someone who's a bit more moderate or maybe even milquetoast is just not cutting through at all because it's like, oh, what is it that you're saying exactly?
But that's where these kind of examples, he's not even trying to be milquetoast with them. Like, he is trying to be a bit bolder. And it's still not cutting through because he's not Pauline Hanson and he never will be, right?
Okay, let's segue to the Labor Party conference, which is where you guys are at this very moment. For listeners who haven't paid much attention, what is the stated purpose of all of this theatre? Paul, set the scene for us.
Yeah, so the Labor conferences occur once every term of government. The Prime Minister, this Prime Minister has brought them forward in the term, so he's had it. This one's about a year after the last election. Some Labor leaders past have had them about a year before the next election to use them as kind of election launching pads. But this Prime Minister been hyper-focused on constantly electioneering and thinking forward well in advance. He's known for his kind of strategic thinking, has brought it earlier in the term to create some coherence about its agenda and to ensure that all of the different arms of the Labor movement and the government are coming together at an early point in the term to set up the framing and strategic thinking for the next election. So effectively what a conference is at an organisational level is a coming together of all the delegates from across the country who are elected at branch level to the same room over 3 days. About half of them are from unions, and unions have their own delegates, and about half are from the rank and file. So it's a little bit less than that because there's a lot of elected MPs as part of those that delegate block as well. And they go through chapters of a hefty party platform document that are on each policy area. People will move amendments to the policy platforms to try and inject new values or specific policies into the document. When that document is agreed upon at the end of the conference, it is formally, technically meant to bind the cabinet to fulfil those obligations. But the get out clause is that it doesn't enforce discipline on when those policies are enacted or precisely how they are enacted.
Yeah.
So the cabinet, if which does have significant control over the conference, does still have ultimate and real control over how the platform is executed.
Yeah, so they're sort of pointing the ship in the direction, but they're not actually precisely plotting its destination or its time of destination. It's often said that the big disputes in Labor Party conference are settled well before the conference, away from the prying eyes of the media and the public, so that Labor can project a united front from the conference itself. Tass, what were the major policy points that were up for grabs this year?
I think if we look at issues that have been dividing the party for a while, we've got things like Israel-Gaza, AUKUS. These have kind of been long-running debates in Labor. More recently, I think a gas tax has become a big issue, and the most recent is around AI and safeguards for workers, creatives and so forth as we move towards an AI world. So with AI, for example, you saw the government get ahead of that one with Albanese's speech the other day. So front-running some of these debates, looking like they're on top of it, a bit of a pressure valve for people to air their views, stop that one blowing up, on the floor of conference or becoming too tense. Similar thing actually with gambling reform. I think there's a view, that's another thing that there's been this real passionate rank and file push for stronger action. The government came through with a watered-down package, but people have said to me, for example, that by at least introducing that package to Parliament last month, they stopped that one blowing up on the floor of conference as well. We've got a few of these events at the conference that happen on the sideline called fringe events for some of these fringe debates, and there will be debate over things like AUKUS and AI and, Labor's position on war. There you've got protesters at the front taking up the issue of gas tax in Gaza. So all these things are kind of happening in the periphery, but I think by and large what we do see now is a conference where a lot of this is kind of negotiated in advance. The wording is agreed to, the debates are slightly stage managed, and also I think people are aware that they don't rock the boat too much when it comes to conference prepper.
Anthony Albanese gave the keynote speech for the conference on Thursday, if that is the correct term. I'm sure it's not the correct term. But what was his central political message?
It really gave me election 2025 flashbacks, to be honest. He even pulled out the green and gold Medicare card again. So there was this, it was doing a couple of things. There was this what would I think sound familiar to voters from the last election, this real focus on bread and butter Labor stuff, workers, healthcare, education. I think the two announcements that Labor made today were interesting. One is extending paid prac payments to students in health, and the other was a new workers' court to settle underpayments and workplace disputes that hasn't existed since Howard abolished the last one in 1997. So there's this real Labor way. This is the Labor way of doing things. But I think what's different since last year is the overarching context and the justification for that. And again, it wasn't just about the coalition. It was about this rising tide of populism, the fact that people are angry and disenchanted and the economy is not working for them. That's a new line for Labor in the last little while. This acknowledgement of grievance, but then this real kind of firm assertion that, well, we don't just respond to grievance by, playing into it. We have to do material things, and those material things are explicitly acting on cost of living. And so I think what was interesting about Albanese's speech was that it married so much of the stuff from last election that was really being pitched as core Labor mission, core Labor values, and also core Labor policy in the things that this government does, which has been a lot of kind of money redistributed to people via under the banner of costing living relief, but then connecting that to this kind of looming one nation threat. And I think we also heard Peter Malinauskas, the Premier of South Australia, speak in a very similar way about Malinauskas was saying, there are two risks for Labor here. One is the risk of complacency, that with this kind of decimated, fragmented Conservative opposition, we become too complacent. But the second risk is that we react to populism and what that kind of beckons. So this framing of, there needs to be a Labor way, which, as Albanese said, was kind of, diversity and progressive, that had a diverse and progressive kind of essence, was that core thing.
Yeah, I think he seemed to be sort of saying, we're not going to engage in culture wars. We're going to answer the culture wars with actual sort of outcomes and policy solutions that help people in their everyday lives. That was the thrust of it. Whether or not that will cut through and whether or not that'll be attractive enough and convincing enough to voters, I guess we'll find out at the next election. But as you say, it did sound a lot like an election pitch. I think we've lost Paul to the vagaries of the Labor Party conference internet
I can
network.
see him now, but I don't know what he's doing.
He's ditched us. He's gone to get a cup of Nescafe at
We
the
haven't
coffee
eaten
station.
Today, so maybe he'll get a head
Right.
start in the
Maybe he's had a blood sugar crash and just vagued out. Tass, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. That was very interesting, and we'll get you back on soon, maybe to talk about the outcomes from the conference.
Talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much.
You can read all of our political news on our websites, theage.com.au and smh.com.au. Today's episode was produced by Chi Wong with help from Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills, and our podcasts are overseen by Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick. Before you go, follow Inside Politics and leave a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm Jacqueline Maley. Thank you for listening.